It was the crisp autumn of 1980 in Millbrook, Michigan, when the maples turned their brilliant reds and golds, painting the small town in colors that should have meant comfort and warmth. The population barely reached 800 souls, the kind of place where everyone knew their neighbor's dog by name, and where the biggest excitement usually came from Friday night football games at the high school. Dorothy Henderson was 28 years old that October, with auburn hair that caught the light just right, and a smile that could disarm the grumpiest customer at Peterson's General Store, where she worked behind the counter 6 days a week. She lived in a modest white clapboard house on Elm Street with her elderly father, Harold, a retired railroad worker whose arthritis kept him mostly confined to his favorite armchair by the window. The house had been in the Henderson family for 3 generations. Dot's grandmother's lace curtains still hung in the front parlor, and the same rotary phone that had connected the family to the outside world since 1952 sat on the kitchen counter, its black bakelite surface worn smooth from decades of use. Dot's routine was as predictable as the church bells that rang every Sunday morning. She would rise at 6:30, brew coffee in the old percolator, and prepare her father's breakfast before walking the 4 blocks to Peterson's. Her lunch break was always at noon sharp, when she would return home to check on Harold and heat up soup from a Campbell's can. Evenings were spent listening to the radio while mending clothes or reading paperback mysteries from the rotating rack at the store. But Dorothy Henderson had a secret that even her closest friends didn't fully understand. Every Tuesday and Thursday evening, she would tell her father she was going to her friend Betty's house for coffee and conversation. Instead, she would drive her 1974 Ford Pinto 20 minutes to the next town over, Cedar Falls, where she had been taking night classes at the community college. She was studying to become a nurse. It wasn't that she was ashamed of her ambition. In 1980, it simply wasn't common for a woman approaching 30 in a small Michigan town to suddenly decide to change her life. Dot had dropped out of high school at 17 to care for her ailing mother, and now, 11 years later, she was quietly working toward her GED while simultaneously taking prerequisite courses for the nursing program. Her notebooks were hidden in a shoebox under her bed, filled with meticulous handwriting about anatomy and medical terminology. She studied by flashlight after her father went to sleep, determined not to disturb his rest with the lamp. On Tuesday, October 14, 1980, Dot followed her usual routine. She worked her shift at Peterson's, helping Mrs. Kowalski pick out fabric for her grandson's Halloween costume and listening to old Mr. Brennan complain about the rising price of motor oil. At 5:30, she locked up the store, deposited the day's cash in the night slot at First National Bank, and walked home. Harold was dozing in his chair when she arrived, the evening news playing softly on their old Zenith television. The anchor was discussing President Carter's campaign troubles and the ongoing hostage crisis in Iran. Dot kissed her father's forehead and went to the kitchen to prepare dinner. They ate beef stew and cornbread while watching Happy Days reruns. Harold had always enjoyed Fonzie's antics and smiled as she watched her father chuckle at the familiar jokes. After clearing the dishes, she helped him to his bedroom and made sure he had his evening medications within reach. At 7:15, Dot picked up her purse and car keys from the kitchen counter. "I'm going over to Betty's dad," she called toward the bedroom. "I'll be back before 10. Harold's muffled response indicated he'd heard her. It was the last conversation they would ever have. Dot drove through the darkening streets of Millbrook in her yellow Pinto, passing the Methodist church where she'd been baptized, the elementary school where she'd learned to read, and the park where she'd had her first kiss with Tommy Brennan behind the gazebo 15 years earlier. The car's radio played soft rock as she turned onto Highway 12, heading toward Cedar Falls. Her chemistry class was scheduled to run from 8 to 9:30 that evening. Professor Williams was covering molecular structure, a subject that challenged but fascinated her in equal measure. She had been looking forward to this particular lesson all week, but Dorothy Henderson never made it to class that night. At 9:45, Professor Williams marked her absent in his attendance book. It was unusual. Tot had only missed 2 classes in the entire semester, both times calling ahead to explain. Her study partner, a young man named Kevin, who worked at the local garage, waited for 15 minutes after class to see if she would arrive, but the parking lot remained empty of yellow pin. Back in Millbrook, Harold Henderson had fallen asleep in his bedroom, unaware that anything was amiss. The house on Elm Street sat quiet and dark, its front porch light burning steadily as it did every evening, waiting for Dot's return. When Harold woke at 6:30 the next morning and called for his daughter to help him with his morning routine, silence answered him. He struggled from his bed, his arthritic joints protesting with each movement, and made his way through the house. Dot's bed was still made, her purse absent from its usual spot on the kitchen counter. The yellow Pinto was not in the driveway. Harold assumed she had stayed at Betty's house overnight. Perhaps her friend had needed comfort over some trouble. It had happened once before, when Betty's husband had been in the hospital. He managed to prepare his own breakfast, and settled in to wait for his daughter's return. By noon, worry began to gnaw at the old man's chest. He picked up the rotary phone and dialed Betty's number, his fingers shaking slightly as he turned the dial. "Henderson residence," Betty answered cheerfully. "Betty, dear, this is Harold. Is Dorothy still with you?" The pause that followed seemed to stretch forever. "Harold, Dot wasn't here last night. I haven't seen her since Sunday at church. Is everything all right?" The phone receiver felt suddenly heavy in Harold's hand. He could hear his own heartbeat in the silence that followed Betty's question. Outside, a dog barked somewhere down the street, and a car engine turned over in a neighbor's driveway. Normal sounds of a normal day in a normal town, where daughters didn't simply vanish. I need to call the police," Harold finally whispered into the phone. Betty arrived at the Henderson house within 10 minutes, her own worry evident in the way she hurried up the front steps without pausing to fix her hair or smooth her dress. She found Harold sitting at the kitchen table, staring at the black telephone, as if it might provide answers to questions he was afraid to ask. Sheriff Jim Crawford arrived shortly after 1 o'clock. He was a tall, lean man with graying temples who had known the Henderson family for over 20 years. His usual easy manner was replaced by careful professionalism as he listened to Harold's account of the previous evening. "Now, Harold, you're certain she said she was going to Betty's house?" Sheriff Crawford asked, his pen poised over a small notepad. "That's what she always said on Tuesdays and Thursdays," Harold replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "I never had reason to doubt her." Betty fidgeted with her handbag strap. "She hasn't been coming to my house, Sheriff. Not on those nights. I just assumed, ... Well, I thought maybe she had a boyfriend she wasn't ready to talk about. You know how private Dot can be." The sheriff made notes in his careful handwriting. In 1980, missing persons cases in small towns were often resolved within hours, usually involving misunderstandings, car trouble, or family dispute. Young women didn't simply disappear without explanation, especially not young women like Dorothy Henderson, who lived quiet, predictable lives in quiet, predictable places. "I'll need a description of her car and what she was wearing," Sheriff Crawford said. "And we'll want to check with the hospital in Cedar Falls. Make sure she didn't have an accident." Single quotes Harold described the yellow 1974 Ford Pinto with its dented rear bumper and the small crack in the driver's side window. Dot had been wearing her blue wool coat, the one with the missing button she'd been meaning to replace, and her good shoes, the black ones she saved for special occasions. Sheriff Betty said quietly, "There's something else. I've seen her car driving toward Cedar Falls on Tuesday and Thursday evening. I just never thought, ... I mean, it wasn't my business to ask." The first tendrils of real concern began to wrap around Sheriff Crawford's chest. Cedar Falls was 20 minutes away by car, over roads that wound through farmland and patches of dense forest. In October, those roads could be treacherous after dark, especially if ice had formed on the bridges. By 4 o'clock that afternoon, Sheriff Crawford had contacted the Cedar Falls Police Department and the county hospital. No accidents had been reported on Highway 12 or any of the connecting roads. No young woman matching Dorothy's description had been admitted to the emergency room. The sheriff drove the route between Millbrook and Cedar Falls twice that evening, his patrol car's spotlights sweeping the ditches and tree lines. He found nothing. No yellow Pinto. No signs of an accident. No clues to suggest where Dorothy Henderson might have gone. As darkness fell on October 15, 1980, the reality began to settle over Millbrook like a heavy blanket. Dorothy Henderson, the quiet young woman who had never caused trouble for anyone, who cared for her elderly father and worked faithfully at Peterson's general store, had simply vanished. The last person to see her alive was her father, Harold, as she kissed his forehead and told him she was going to Betty's house. The last words she spoke to anyone were a gentle lie, told with love to protect an old man from worrying about ambitions that seemed too fragile to share. In the days that followed, volunteers would search the forests and fields surrounding the highway. Police would question everyone in both Millbrook and Cedar Falls who might have seen something. The local newspaper would run a front-page story with Dorothy's high school graduation photo, asking anyone with information to come forward. But as October turned to November, and November faded into the harsh Michigan winter, Dorothy Henderson remained gone. Her yellow Pinto had vanished as completely as she had, leaving behind only questions that echoed through the small community like whispers in an empty house. Harold Henderson would sit by his window every evening for the rest of his life, watching the street for a flash of yellow that never came. Betty would blame herself for not asking the right questions when she had the chance. Sheriff Crawford would keep Dorothy's case file on his desk for 3 decades, adding notes whenever a new lead emerged, which happened less and less frequently as the years passed. And in Cedar Falls, Professor Williams would mark Dorothy Henderson absent in his attendance book, night after night, semester after semester, until her name became a ghost in the college records, a reminder of dreams interrupted and futures left unfulfilled. The evening of October 14th, 1980, had begun like any other in Millbrook, Michigan. By its end, the town had learned that some mysteries are too deep for small-town logic to solve, and some absences too profound for time to heal. Dorothy Henderson had become a question mark in human form, a puzzle that would haunt her community for decades to come. The search for Dorothy Henderson began at dawn on October 16, 1980, when Sheriff Crawford organized the first official volunteer effort. Word had spread through Millbrook with the efficiency that only small towns possess through phone calls that interrupted dinner preparations, conversations whispered in grocery store aisles, and the solemn nods exchanged between neighbors who had known each other for decades. By 7 in the morning, nearly 200 people had gathered in the parking lot of Millbrook High School. They came carrying thermoses of coffee, wearing their heaviest coats against the October chill, and carrying flashlights even though the sun was already painting the eastern sky in pale gold. Farmers arrived in pickup trucks, loaded with hay bales to mark search areas. Women from the Methodist Church brought sandwiches wrapped in wax paper and gallon jugs of hot coffee. Harold Henderson sat in the passenger seat of Sheriff Crawford's patrol car, wrapped in a wool blanket, his aged eyes scanning the faces of his neighbors. He had insisted on being present, despite his arthritis, and despite the obvious toll that 36 hours of worry had taken on his frail frame. "She's a good driver," Harold told anyone who would listen. "Never had so much as a fender bender. Something happened to her. Something bad." The volunteers divided into groups of 8 to 10, each led by a deputy or an experienced hunter who knew the terrain. They would walk in lines 20 feet apart, covering every inch of ground between Millbrook and Cedar Falls. The plan was methodical and thorough, exactly the kind of organized effort that small communities excel at when one of their own is in trouble. Mrs. Peterson, Dorothy's employer, had closed the general store for the day so she could join the search. Dorothy never missed work without calling. She told the reporter from the Millbrook Gazette, who was documenting the effort. "In 3 years, she's never once left me wondering where she was. This isn't like her at all." The first day of searching yielded nothing but sore feet and growing anxiety. Volunteers combed through drainage ditches, abandoned barns, and stretches of woodland where a car might have slid off the road unnoticed. They called Dorothy's name until their voices grew hoarse, the sound echoing off the bare trees and returning to them empty. As evening approached, and the volunteer groups began returning to the high school parking lot, the reality of Dorothy's disappearance settled more deeply into the community's consciousness. This wasn't going to be a quick resolution. This wasn't going to be a story they would laugh about in a few years, remembering the time Dorothy got lost and scared everyone. Sheriff Crawford stood before the assembled volunteers as the sun set behind the school building. His usually confident demeanor showed cracks of uncertainty that made everyone uncomfortable. In 30 years of law enforcement, he had never dealt with a missing person case that didn't resolve itself within 48 hours. "We'll continue tomorrow," he announced, his voice carrying across the parking lot. "Michigan State Police are sending additional officers to assist. We're going to expand the search area and bring in some tracking dogs." The crowd dispersed slowly, people lingering to offer comfort to Harold Henderson or to share theories about what might have happened. The most common explanation was a car accident, in some remote location, perhaps. Dorothy had taken an unfamiliar route and ended up in a ravine or pond where the vehicle couldn't be easily spotted. But there were other theories, whispered in smaller groups. Some remembered that Dorothy had been acting differently in recent months, more distracted, more secretive. Had she been planning to leave Millbrook? Did she have debts or troubles that no one knew about? The discovery that she had been lying about her Tuesday and Thursday destinations made people wonder what other secrets she might have been keeping. Betty Morrison found herself in the uncomfortable position of being questioned repeatedly about Dorothy's supposed I keep thinking I should have asked her more questions, she told her husband that night as they sat in their kitchen. I knew something was different about her these past few months, but I respected her privacy. Maybe if I had pushed a little harder, ... single quotes. The second day of searching brought 40-degree temperatures and a steady drizzle that soaked through jackets and made the fallen leaves slippery underfoot. The volunteer numbers had dropped to about 75 people, mostly the closest family friends and those with the strongest sense of community obligation. The tracking dogs arrived from Grand Rapids to German Shepherds with their handler, a quiet man named Officer Martinez who had been working search and rescue for 15 years. The dogs were given articles of Dorothy's clothing to establish her scent, then led along Highway 12 and the various side roads she might have taken. The dogs showed interest in several areas along the main route, but none of the leads developed into concrete evidence. At one point, both animals became agitated near a rest area about halfway to Cedar Falls, circling and whining in a way that made their handler believe they had detected Dorothy's scent. But a thorough search of the area revealed nothing. No signs of struggle, no personal belonging, no indication that Dorothy had ever stopped there. By the end of the first week, the organized volunteer searches had been suspended. Sheriff Crawford made the decision reluctantly, but the reality was that they had covered every reasonable area multiple times. If Dorothy and her car were somewhere in the immediate vicinity, they would have been found. The Michigan State Police took over the investigation, bringing resources and expertise that the small Millbrook department couldn't match. Detective Lieutenant Sarah Walsh was assigned as the lead investigator, a methodical woman in her 40s who had worked dozens of missing person cases throughout the state. Detective Walsh's first priority was to uncover the truth about Dorothy's secret activities on Tuesday and Thursday evening. It took less than a day to discover her enrollment at Cedar Falls Community College and her attendance in Professor Williams' chemistry class. She was a dedicated student, Professor Williams told Detective Walsh during their interview. Quiet, but very focused. She always sat in the front row and took detailed notes. I had the impression that education meant a great deal to her. The revelation that Dorothy had been secretly pursuing her education cast her disappearance in a new light. This wasn't the simple story of a young woman who lived an entirely predictable life. Dorothy Henderson had been planning for a future that no one in Millbrook knew about. Kevin Morrison, Dorothy's study partner in the chemistry class, provided additional insights that deepened the mystery. She never talked much about her personal life, he told Detective Walsh, but a couple of weeks ago, she seemed worried about something. She kept checking her watch during class, and she asked me if I thought it was possible for someone to change their whole life at 28. Kevin also mentioned that Dorothy had been carrying more cash than usual in recent weeks. She paid for her textbooks with a roll of 20, he recalled. Said she'd been saving up for her nursing program. Must have been $400 or $500, which seemed like a lot for someone working at a general store. This detail troubled Detective Walsh. If Dorothy had been saving money for her future education, why would she abandon it? And where had a general store clerk gotten several $100s in cash? The investigation into Dorothy's financial situation revealed another surprise. Her savings account at First National Bank contained nearly $3,000, far more than anyone expected from her modest salary. When questioned, Bank President Robert Fuller explained that Dorothy had been making regular deposits for over 2 years, sometimes as much as $100 at a time. She was very disciplined about her savings, Fuller told Detective Walsh. Never made withdrawals, never asked about the balance. Just came in every few weeks with cash to deposit. Harold Henderson was bewildered by these revelations about his daughter's secret life. I don't understand where she got that kind of money, he told Detective Walsh, his voice weak with confusion and fatigue. She gave me money for groceries and utilities, but I never asked her to account for every penny. She was 28 years old, not a child. The mystery deepened when Detective Walsh discovered that Dorothy had been earning additional income by doing bookkeeping for several local businesses. Mrs. Chen, who owned a Chinese restaurant in Cedar Falls, confirmed that Dorothy had been helping her with taxes and financial records for over a year. She was very good with numbers, Mrs. Chen explained, very trustworthy. She would come in after her evening class and work for 2 hours, sometimes 3. I paid her $25 each time. Similar arrangements existed with a gas station owner and a small construction company. Dorothy had been quietly building a network of part-time work that allowed her to save money for her nursing education without drawing attention to her plans. As November arrived and the investigation continued, Detective Walsh began to develop a profile of Dorothy Henderson that differed significantly from the simple, predictable young woman her neighbors thought they knew. This was someone with ambition, determination, and the intelligence to pursue her goals methodically and discreetly. But if Dorothy had been planning for her future, why would she disappear without warning? And why had she left behind the savings account that represented years of careful planning? The investigation expanded beyond Millbrook and Cedar Falls. Detective Walsh contacted nursing schools throughout Michigan to see if Dorothy had submitted applications. She checked bus stations and airports for any record of ticket purchases. She interviewed every student and instructor at Cedar Falls Community College who might have had contact with Dorothy. The trail grew colder with each passing day. Winter arrived early that year, with snow falling before Thanksgiving and temperatures dropping below freezing for days at a time. The reality of a Michigan winter made outdoor searches impossible, and it also meant that if Dorothy's car was hidden somewhere in the vast wilderness areas surrounding the two towns, it might not be found until spring. Harold Henderson's health began to deteriorate noticeably as the months passed. Neighbors took turns checking on him, bringing meals, and helping with household tasks that Dorothy had previously handled. The Methodist Church organized a rotation of volunteers to ensure that the old man was never alone for more than a few hours. He keeps waiting for her to come home, Betty Morrison told her husband one evening after spending the afternoon with Harold. He won't let anyone move her things or change anything in her room. He sits by that front window every evening, watching for her car. The media attention that had initially focused on Dorothy's disappearance gradually faded as other stories captured public interest. The Millbrook Gazette continued to run updates on the investigation. But by Christmas 1980, these had been reduced to brief mentions buried on inside pages. Detective Walsh remained committed to the case, but she also had to acknowledge the reality of her case. Missing person investigations require active leads to justify continued resources, and Dorothy Henderson's case was producing fewer and fewer promising developments. The last significant lead of 1980 came from a truck driver who claimed to have seen a yellow Ford Pinto broken down on Highway 12 on the night of Dorothy's disappearance. He said he had considered stopping to offer help, but noticed that the driver appeared to be talking to someone in a dark-colored sedan that was parked behind the Pinto. I figured she had help already, the truck driver told Detective Walsh. Didn't think much of it until I saw the missing person story in the paper. But the truck driver's account was vague and unverifiable. He couldn't remember the exact location, couldn't describe the people involved, and admitted that his attention had been focused on the road ahead rather than the scene he was passing. As 1981 began, Dorothy Henderson had been missing for more than 2 months. Her case file had grown to include dozens of interviews, hundreds of pages of reports, and a collection of evidence that painted a picture of a young woman with secret ambitions but no apparent reason to disappear. The investigation remained officially active, but Detective Walsh knew that without new evidence or witnesses, the chances of solving Dorothy's disappearance were diminishing rapidly. Missing person cases that aren't resolved within the first few weeks often remain cold for years, sometimes forever. In Millbrook, life gradually adapted to Dorothy's absence. Mrs. Peterson hired a new clerk for the general store, a teenager named Susan, who was eager but lacked Dorothy's experience with the regular customers. The Tuesday and Thursday evening chemistry classes at Cedar Falls Community College continued without her, and Professor Williams eventually stopped marking her absent in his attendance book. But the impact of Dorothy's disappearance extended far beyond the practical adjustment. The town had lost something intangible, a sense of security, a belief that bad things happen to other people in other places. Millbrook had always been the kind of community where people left their doors unlocked and children walked to school alone. Dorothy's vanishing changed that fundamental trust. Parents began driving their teenagers to evening activities rather than letting them walk. Women traveling alone started checking in with family members more frequently. The Methodist Church added a prayer for Dorothy to their weekly service, and her name became a reminder that even the safest places harbor mysteries. By spring 1981, the snow had melted, and revealed no new clues about Dorothy's fate. Volunteer groups organized additional searches of areas that had been inaccessible during the winter. But these efforts were smaller and less optimistic than the massive response of the previous October. Harold Henderson celebrated his 71st birthday alone, surrounded by cards from neighbors, but missing the one person whose presence would have mattered. He had aged visibly in the months since Dorothy's disappearance, his arthritis worsening, and his memory becoming less reliable. "Sometimes I forget she's gone," he confided to Sheriff Crawford during one of the lawman's regular welfare checks. "I'll call for her to help me with something, and then I remember. It's like losing her all over again, every time." The first anniversary of Dorothy's disappearance arrived, with autumn leaves falling around the Henderson house on Elm Street. A memorial service was held at the Methodist Church, attended by most of the community, and several of Dorothy's classmates from Cedar Falls. Detective Walsh spoke briefly about the ongoing investigation, but her words carried more hope than conviction. Harold Henderson sat in the front pew, clutching a photograph of Dorothy taken at Christmas 1979, the last holiday they had celebrated together. In the picture, she was smiling beside their small Christmas tree, unaware that within 10 months she would be gone, and her father would be left with nothing but questions and memories. The service ended with the congregation singing Amazing Grace, Dorothy's favorite hymn. As the final notes faded in the old church, the reality settled over Millbrook once again. Dorothy Henderson had been gone for exactly 1 year, and despite the efforts of law enforcement, volunteers, and a community that refused to forget her, she remained as missing as she had been on that first terrible morning when Harold called her name and received only silence. The investigation would continue, officially and unofficially, but the search had transformed from an urgent rescue mission into something else entirely, a long, patient wait for answers that might never come. Outside the church, the October wind scattered leaves across the cemetery where Dorothy's mother was buried, and where a small memorial stone would eventually be placed bearing Dorothy's name and the simple inscription, "Beloved daughter, still waiting to come home." Time had become the enemy now, making memories fade and witnesses forget details that might have been crucial. With each passing season, Dorothy Henderson's disappearance settled more deeply into the history of Millbrook, Michigan, a mystery that would define the town for decades to come. 17 years had passed since Dorothy Henderson vanished from Millbrook, Michigan. It was the summer of 1997, and the town had grown by nearly 300 residents, most of them young families drawn by affordable housing and the promise of small-town safety. A new generation of children played in the same park where Dorothy had once walked with her high school friends, oblivious to the mystery that had haunted their community for nearly 2 decades. Harold Henderson had passed away in the spring of 1994, at the age of 84. He had spent his final 13 years waiting by the front window of the house on Elm Street, watching for a yellow Ford Pinto that never returned. His death certificate listed heart failure as the cause, but those who knew him understood that Harold had died of a broken heart, worn down by years of unanswered questions and hope deferred too long. The Henderson house had remained empty since Harold's death, tied up in probate proceedings while distant relatives debated its fate. The white clapboard siding had begun to peel, and the front porch sagged slightly under the weight of 3 harsh Michigan winters. Neighborhood children whispered that the house was haunted, though their parents were quick to correct such nonsense with gentle reminders about respect for the dead. On July 15, 1997, a demolition crew arrived at 847 Elm Street. The distant relatives had finally reached an agreement to sell the property to a developer who planned to tear down the old house and build a modern ranch-style home in its place. The crew was led by Frank Kowalski Jr., whose grandmother had known Dorothy and whose mother had participated in the original search efforts 17 years earlier. Frank had been only 11 years old when Dorothy disappeared, but he remembered the tension that had gripped Millbrook during those terrible weeks of searching. He also remembered his grandmother's stories about Dorothy, how she had been kind to everyone, how she had helped his grandmother pick out fabric at Peterson's general store, how she had simply vanished like morning mist. The demolition was scheduled to take 3 days. The first day would involve clearing out any remaining contents and checking for items of value or sentimental import. The second day would see the removal of interior walls and fixtures. The third day would bring the structure down entirely. Frank's crew consisted of 4 men: himself, his brother-in-law Mike, and 2 day laborers named Eddie and Tom. They arrived at the Henderson house at 7 in the morning, their pickup trucks loaded with sledgehammers, pry bars, and heavy-duty trash bags. The interior of the house was like stepping back in time. Harold had left everything exactly as it had been on the night Dorothy disappeared. Her coffee cup still sat in the kitchen sink, stained brown with 17-year-old residue. Her blue wool coat hung on a peg by the back door, the missing button never replaced. In her bedroom, nursing textbooks were stacked neatly on the nightstand, bookmarked with strips of paper marking her progress through lessons she would never complete. "Feels wrong, somehow," Mike murmured as they surveyed the frozen tableau of an interrupted life. "Like we're grave robbers or something." Frank nodded, understanding the sentiment. There was something deeply unsettling about dismantling the evidence of Dorothy's existence, even after all these years. But sentiment couldn't override economics, and they had a job to complete. They worked methodically through the morning, sorting items into categories: things that might have value, things that should be donated to charity, and things that could only be discarded. Dorothy's clothes went into donation bags. Harold's collection of railroad memorabilia would be offered to the local historical society. The furniture, much of it dating from the 1940s and 1950s, was solid enough to find new homes. It was Eddie who discovered the loose floorboard. He was in Dorothy's bedroom, removing the baseboards so they could be salvaged for the historical society, when his pry bar slipped and struck the floor at an odd angle. Instead of the solid thunk of wood against wood, there was a hollow sound that made him pause. "Hey, Frank," Eddie called. "Come take a look at this." Frank knelt beside Eddie and examined the spot where the pry bar had struck. One of the floorboards, about 3 feet from Dorothy's bed, had shifted slightly when hit. When Frank pressed down on it, the board moved with the kind of give that suggested it wasn't properly nailed down. "Probably just old construction," Frank said. But his curiosity was aroused. He worked the pry bar under the edge of the board and lifted gently. The board came up easily, revealing a rectangular space beneath that had been carefully hollowed out between the floor joists. "Well, I'll be damned," Mike whispered. Inside the hidden compartment was a metal box, approximately the size of a shoebox, painted dark green and spotted with rust. Next to it was a manila envelope, thick with contents and sealed with tape that had yellowed with age. Frank lifted the box carefully. It was heavier than expected, and something shifted inside when he moved it. The manila envelope felt substantial in his hands, as if it contained a significant number of papers. "What do you think?" Eddie asked, his voice hushed with the reverence that unexpected discoveries demand. Frank sat back on his heels, still holding the box and envelope. His first instinct was to open them immediately, but something made him hesitate. These items had been hidden deliberately, placed beneath Dorothy Henderson's floorboards by someone who wanted them to remain secret. After 17 years, they might contain answers to questions that had tormented an entire community. "We need to call the police," Frank said finally. "This isn't ours to open," Mike protested mildly. "Come on, Frank. It's probably just old photographs or love letters. Nothing important." But Frank was already reaching for his cell phone. He had lived through the years of uncertainty that followed Dorothy's disappearance. He had watched his grandmother worry and wonder, had seen the way the mystery had changed Millbrook's sense of itself. If there was even a chance that these hidden items contained information about Dorothy's fate, they needed to be handled properly. Sheriff Crawford had retired in 1989. Replaced by a younger man named Sheriff David Martinez, who had moved to Millbrook from Grand Rapids. Sheriff Martinez had heard the stories about Dorothy Henderson, but the case had been cold for over a decade when he took office. It existed in his mind more as local folklore than as an active investigation. But when Frank Kowalski called to report the discovery of hidden items in Dorothy's bedroom, Sheriff Martinez felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that comes with unexpected developments in old cases. He arrived at the Henderson house within 20 minutes, accompanied by Deputy Sarah Chen, whose mother had been one of Dorothy's customers at Peterson's General Store. Frank led them to Dorothy's bedroom and showed them the hidden compartment. The metal box and manila envelope sat exactly where they had been found, untouched since Frank's call. "You did the right thing," Sheriff Martinez told Frank. "These could be evidence in a missing person case, using latex gloves." Sheriff Martinez carefully lifted the metal box and envelope from their hiding place. The box was secured with a small padlock that had corroded over the years. The envelope was sealed, but not locked, though the tape was so old and brittle that it would require careful handling to open without destroying the contents. "We'll take these to the station and document everything properly, Sheriff Martinez said. I'll contact the state police and see if Detective Walsh is still available to consult on this. Detective Walsh, now Lieutenant Walsh, and nearing retirement, was indeed available and intensely interested in the discovery. She had never forgotten Dorothy Henderson's case, and it had remained one of the few unsolved disappearances that truly bothered her. She drove to Millbrook that same afternoon, arriving at the police station as Sheriff Martinez was preparing to open the envelope. After 17 years, Lieutenant Walsh said as she examined the envelope, I thought we'd heard the last of Dorothy Henderson. The envelope was opened with meticulous care, its contents photographed before being removed. Inside were 43 pages of handwritten material in Dorothy's familiar script, along with several photographs and what appeared to be receipts or notes written by other people. The photographs were the first items to be examined. They showed Dorothy in locations that none of her family or friends had ever seen her visit. In one, she stood beside a lake that didn't exist anywhere near Millbrook or Cedar Falls. In another, she was sitting at what appeared to be a restaurant table across from a man whose face was partially obscured by shadows. But it was the handwritten pages that contained the real revelation. They were diary entries, dating from March 1980 through October 13, 1980, the day before Dorothy's disappearance. The entries began, innocuously enough, documenting Dorothy's decision to pursue nursing school and her careful planning to save money without alerting her father to her ambitions. But by summer, the entries had taken on a different tone entirely. June 15, 1980. I can't keep pretending this is just about school anymore. Every Tuesday and Thursday when I tell Dad I'm going to Betty's, I feel like I'm lying about everything, not just the classes. But how can I tell him about Robert? How can I explain that I've fallen in love with a married man? The name Robert appeared frequently in the subsequent entries. Lieutenant Walsh and Sheriff Martinez read with growing amazement as Dorothy's secret life unfolded on the handwritten pages. Robert was apparently a professor at Cedar Falls Community College, though not one of Dorothy's instructors. They had met in the library, where Dorothy often studied between her bookkeeping jobs and her chemistry class. July 22, 1980. Robert says his wife doesn't understand him, that their marriage has been over in everything but name for years. I know how that sounds like every cliché about married men and the foolish women who believe them. But when I'm with him, everything feels possible. He makes me believe I can become the person I've always wanted to be. The entries revealed that Dorothy and Robert had been meeting regularly throughout the summer and early fall of 1980. Sometimes they would drive to restaurants in towns where they were unlikely to encounter anyone they knew. Other times they would meet at Robert's office after hours, when the college building was nearly empty. August 30th, 1980. Robert showed me photographs of houses in North Carolina today. He says there's a hospital there that would hire me as soon as I finish my nursing degree, even without experience. He says we could start over there, where no one knows either of us. I want to believe it's possible, but I keep thinking about Dad. How can I leave him? How can I stay? By September, Dorothy's entries had become increasingly conflicted. She was clearly in love with Robert and excited about the possibility of a new life, but she was also tormented by guilt about her father and uncertainty about Robert's intentions. September 18, 1980. Robert brought divorce papers to show me today. He says he's finally filed, that by Christmas we'll be free to start our life together. But something feels wrong about the way he talks about leaving. He keeps asking about my savings, about whether I have enough money to make a clean break. When I told him about the $3,000, his whole demeanor changed. He became more affectionate, more urgent about our plans. The final entries, written in early October 1980, revealed Dorothy's growing suspicions about Robert's true motives. October 8, 1980. I followed Robert home tonight, after our dinner in Cedar Falls. I know I shouldn't have, but something has been bothering me for weeks. The house he went to doesn't look like the home of a man getting divorced. There were children's bicycles in the driveway, and a woman's car in the garage. When the front door opened, I saw him embrace a woman and two small children. They looked like a happy family. They looked like people who have never discussed divorce. October 13th, 1980. Tomorrow I'm going to confront Robert about what I saw. I think he's been lying to me about everything. The divorce, his plans to move to North Carolina, maybe even his feelings for me. I've been such a fool. I've saved every penny for a future that probably never existed. I've lied to Dad, lied to Betty, lied to myself. Whatever happens tomorrow night, I have to know the truth. The diary ended there, with Dorothy's final entry written on the day before her disappearance. Lieutenant Walsh sat back in her chair, absorbing the implications of Dorothy's words. After 17 years of wondering what had happened to the quiet young woman from Millbrook, they finally had a picture of her secret life and a potential motive for her disappearance. "We need to find out who Robert was," Lieutenant Walsh said. "And we need to find out what happened when Dorothy confronted him on October 14, 1980. Sheriff Martinez was already reaching for the phone to call Cedar Falls Community College. After 17 years, it would be challenging to locate employment records from 1980, but not impossible. Someone named Robert had been on the faculty or staff that fall, and he had been involved with Dorothy Henderson in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. As the afternoon sun slanted through the windows of the Millbrook police station, the metal box remained unopened on Sheriff Martinez's desk. But already, just from the contents of the manila envelope, Dorothy Henderson's case had been transformed from a cold mystery into an active investigation with specific leads and suspects. The discovery beneath the floorboards of 847 Elm Street had broken 17 years of silence. Dorothy's own words, preserved in her careful handwriting, were finally ready to tell the story of what had happened in the autumn of 1980. But they were also raising new questions that would prove even more disturbing than the original mystery of her disappearance. Who was Robert, and what had he done when Dorothy threatened to expose his lies? Was Dorothy Henderson still alive somewhere, or had her confrontation with a married man led to something far more sinister? The metal box, still locked and unopened, sat waiting to provide more answers. But Lieutenant Walsh suspected that Dorothy's diary had already revealed the most important truth. Her disappearance had not been random or accidental. Someone had a motive to make Dorothy Henderson vanish, and after 17 years, that someone might finally be brought to justice. The metal box was opened on the morning of July 16, 1997, in the presence of Lieutenant Walsh, Sheriff Martinez, and a forensic specialist from the Michigan State Police. The corroded padlock yielded to bolt cutters, and the lid creaked open to reveal contents that would finally solve the mystery of Dorothy Henderson's disappearance after 17 years of silence. Inside the box, wrapped in a plastic bag that had protected them from moisture and decay, were Dorothy's nursing school application materials, acceptance letters from 3 different programs, all dated September 1980, scholarship documentation that would have covered most of her tuition costs, letters of recommendation from her chemistry professor and from Mrs. Chen, praising Dorothy's dedication and intelligence. But beneath these documents lay something far more significant: a cassette tape recorder, a model that had been common in 1980, along with a single audio cassette labeled in Dorothy's handwriting. October 14, 1984, Dad, if something happens to me. Lieutenant Walsh held the cassette with hands that trembled slightly. After nearly 2 decades in law enforcement, she had learned to expect the unexpected. But finding Dorothy's voice preserved on magnetic tape felt like discovering a message from beyond the grave. "We'll need to be careful with this," the forensics specialist warned. "Magnetic tape degrades over time, especially in temperature fluctuation. We might only get one chance to hear it clearly." The cassette was taken to the State Police Laboratory in Lansing, where audio restoration specialists worked for 6 hours to maximize the quality of the 17-year-old recording. When they finally played it back, Dorothy Henderson's voice filled the room with startling clarity, as if she was speaking from across a span of mere hours rather than decades. "If you're hearing this, Dad, it means something has happened to me, and I'm probably not coming home." Dorothy's voice was calm, but tinged with an underlying tension that made everyone in the room lean forward, unconsciously. "I need you to know that I love you, and I need you to know the truth about where I've been going on Tuesday and Thursday nights." The recording lasted 43 minutes. Dorothy had used it to confess everything to her father: her enrollment in nursing school, her dreams of becoming a registered nurse, her part-time bookkeeping jobs, and most importantly, her relationship with Robert Caldwell. Robert Caldwell. Finally, they had a full name. "Robert is a biology professor at Cedar Falls Community College," Dorothy's voice explained. "He's 34 years old, married, with 2 children. I know how that sounds, Dad, and I know how disappointed you must be if you're hearing this, but I fell in love with him, and I believed him when he said he was getting divorced." Dorothy's recorded confession detailed the same timeline that her diary had revealed, but with additional specifics that proved crucial to the investigation. She named restaurants where she and Robert had met, described his car, a dark blue 1978 Chevrolet Malibu, and provided his home address on Maple Drive in Cedar Falls. "Tonight, I'm going to confront Robert about his lies," Dorothy continued on the tape. "I followed him home last week, and I saw him with his family. There's no divorce, Dad. There never was. I think he's been using me, maybe for my money, maybe just because he could. But I can't keep living this lie." The most chilling part of the recording came near the end, when Dorothy's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "I'm scared, Dad. Not just scared that Robert will be angry when I confront him, but scared of something else. Last Thursday night, when we were in his office, Robert got a phone call. He thought I was in the restroom, but I could hear his voice through the door. He was talking to someone about solving the Dorothy problem, and about how accidents happen all the time on those back roads. I pretended I hadn't heard anything, but I can't stop thinking about it." Dorothy's voice strengthened again as she concluded the recording. "I've hidden my diary and these papers under the floorboard in my bedroom, along with this tape. If something happens to me, I want you to know that I was trying to build a better life, not just for myself, but for both of us. The nursing programs have accepted me, Dad. I could have graduated in 2 years and gotten a job at the hospital in Grand Rapids. We could have had a real future together." The tape ended with the soft click of Dorothy stopping the recording. In the silence that followed, Lieutenant Walsh realized she was crying. After 17 years of wondering what had happened to Dorothy Henderson, they finally had the answer, and it was worse than anyone had imagined. The investigation into Robert Caldwell began immediately. Cedar Falls Community College confirmed that Robert James Caldwell had been employed as an associate professor of biology from 1978 to 1981. He had left the college abruptly in November 1980, citing family emergency as his reason for breaking his employment contract. College personnel records provided Caldwell's address and family information from 1980. He had indeed been married to a woman named Patricia Caldwell, with 2 children aged 6 and 8. More disturbing was the discovery that Caldwell had been the subject of unofficial complaints from female students about inappropriate behavior, though no formal charges had ever been filed. He had a pattern, Lieutenant Walsh explained to Sheriff Martinez as they reviewed Caldwell's file. Young women, usually older students returning to school, usually women with some financial resource. Dorothy fit his profile perfectly. The next step was locating Robert Caldwell in 1997. Driver's license records showed that he had moved to Ohio in 1981, then to Pennsylvania in 1985, and finally to Florida in 1990. Each move seemed to coincide with job changes that suggested he was staying ahead of problems that might have been catching up with him. The current address listed for Robert Caldwell was an apartment complex in Tampa, Florida. Local police confirmed that he was still living there, working as a substitute teacher in the Hillsborough County school system. When approached by Detective Frank Morrison of the Tampa Police Department, Caldwell initially denied any knowledge of Dorothy Henderson. "I taught at a lot of colleges over the years," Caldwell told Detective Morrison. "I can't be expected to remember every student." But when confronted with specific details from Dorothy's diary and recording details that only someone intimately involved with her could have known, Caldwell's demeanor changed dramatically. He became agitated, demanded a lawyer, and ultimately refused to answer any additional questions. However, his initial reaction had been enough to convince Detective Morrison that they were dealing with someone who had significant knowledge about Dorothy's disappearance. A search warrant was obtained for Caldwell's apartment, and the results provided the final pieces of the puzzle. Hidden in a bedroom closet, inside a box of old textbooks and academic papers, investigators found a collection of items that painted a disturbing picture of Robert Caldwell's activities in 1980. There were photographs of Dorothy, taken without her knowledge, pictures of her entering her chemistry class, walking to her car, even sitting in restaurants where she thought she was meeting Caldwell privately. More damaging was a handwritten journal that Caldwell had apparently kept during his relationship with Dorothy. The entries were clinical and calculating, describing his manipulation of Dorothy's emotions and his plans to gain access to her savings account. August 15, 1980. Dorothy is becoming more trusting. She mentioned her savings again today. Said she has almost $3,000. That's more than enough for my purposes. Need to convince her to withdraw it soon. September 10th, 1980. Dorothy is getting suspicious about the divorce. Need to be more careful about maintaining the deception. Perhaps it's time to move to the final phase. October 10th, 1980. Dorothy followed me home. She knows about Patricia and the kids. This complicates things significantly. May need to implement the contingency plan sooner than anticipated. The final entry was dated October 14, 1980, the night Dorothy disappeared. October 14, 1980. Dorothy confronted me tonight, as planned. She was angry and threatened to expose everything to the college administration and to Patricia. I convinced her to drive to the old quarry road to discuss things privately. The rest proceeded according to plan. Problem solved. When confronted with his own journal, Robert Caldwell finally broke down and confessed. The story he told was even more chilling than investigators had expected. Caldwell had been running a long-term scam, targeting older female students with some financial resources. He would seduce them, gain their trust, convince them to withdraw their savings for fictitious future plans, then disappear with their money. Dorothy was not his first victim, merely his most trusting one. On the night of October 14, 1980, Dorothy had indeed confronted Caldwell about his lies. He convinced her to drive to an isolated area near an abandoned quarry outside Cedar Falls, ostensibly so they could talk privately without being seen by anyone who might know them. She was crying, Caldwell told investigators, his voice devoid of emotion. She said she had trusted me, that she had changed her whole life. She threatened to go to the police, to tell my wife, to ruin my career. I couldn't let that happen. What happened next was a premeditated murder, disguised as an accident. Caldwell had brought tools with him, a tire iron and rope. He attacked Dorothy beside her car, then used the rope to drag her body into the quarry. Her yellow Ford Pinto was driven to a remote location and pushed into a different section of the same quarry, where it sank in deep water. I thought it would look like she had run away, Caldwell explained. Everyone knew she was secretive about something. I figured people would assume she had left town to start over somewhere else. For 17 years, Caldwell's plan had worked perfectly. He had taken Dorothy's savings money she had planned to use for nursing school, and used it to relocate to Ohio, where he started over with a new teaching position, and eventually a new identity. Over the years, he had repeated similar scams with other women, though he claimed that Dorothy was the only one he had killed. She was different, he said during his confession. The others were easier to get rid of. They were embarrassed about being fooled and didn't want to make trouble. But Dorothy was stubborn. She wasn't going to let it go. The quarry, where Dorothy's body had been dumped, was drained in August 1997. More than 17 years after her death, her remains were found exactly where Caldwell had indicated, along with the remains of her yellow Ford Pinto. The car's trunk contained Dorothy's purse, her nursing school acceptance letters, and the roll of cash she had withdrawn from her savings account on the day she died, money that Caldwell had never bothered to retrieve after killing her. Robert Caldwell was extradited to Michigan and charged with first-degree murder. At his trial in January 1998, prosecutors presented Dorothy's diary, her final recording to her father, and Caldwell's own journal documenting his premeditated plan to kill her. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning a guilty verdict. Caldwell was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. During the sentencing hearing, Dorothy's elderly cousin Clara spoke on behalf of the family that Dorothy had left behind. Dorothy was a dreamer, Clara said, her voice steady despite her tears. She dreamed of becoming a nurse, of helping people, of building a better life for herself and her father. Robert Caldwell didn't just kill Dorothy, he killed those dreams, and all the good she might have done in the world. The trial revealed that Caldwell had indeed victimized other women over the years, though Dorothy was his only murder victim. 3 other women came forward during the investigation to report similar experiences with Caldwell, romantic relationships built on lies, financial manipulation, and emotional abuse that had left them devastated but alive. Dorothy Henderson was finally laid to rest beside her parents in Millbrook Cemetery on September 15, 1998, 18 years after her disappearance. The entire community attended the funeral, including many people who had participated in the original search efforts in 1980. Sheriff Martinez spoke at the service, reflecting on the long journey from Dorothy's disappearance to the resolution of her case. Dorothy Henderson's story reminds us that evil can hide behind the most ordinary faces, he said. But it also reminds us that truth has a way of surviving, even when buried for decades. Dorothy's own words brought her killer to justice. Frank Kowalski, the the demolition contractor whose discovery had broken the case open, was also in attendance. He had decided not to tear down the Henderson house after all, instead renovating it and donating it to a non-profit organization that provided housing for single mothers, pursuing education, a fitting tribute to Dorothy's memory and dreams. The house on Elm Street became known as the Dorothy Henderson House, and a small plaque by the front door commemorated her life and aspirations. The plaque read, "In memory of Dorothy Henderson, 1952 to 1980, who dreamed of healing others, and whose courage in death brought justice for herself and protection for future victims." Lieutenant Walsh retired shortly after Caldwell's conviction, ending a 30-year career in law enforcement. Dorothy Henderson's case had been her last major investigation, and she considered it her most important. "Some cases stay with you forever," she said in her retirement speech. "Dorothy's case taught me that we should never stop looking for answers, no matter how much time has passed." The revelation of Dorothy's murder had a profound impact on the policies and procedures at Cedar Falls Community College. New protocols were implemented to prevent faculty members from taking advantage of vulnerable students, and a counseling center was established to provide support for adult learners who might be particularly susceptible to manipulation. Mrs. Chen, who had employed Dorothy for bookkeeping work, established a scholarship fund in Dorothy's name to help single women pursue nursing education. The scholarship was funded partly by donations from the Millbrook community, and partly by the recovery of Dorothy's original savings, which had been preserved as evidence and eventually returned to her estate. Betty Morrison, Dorothy's friend, who had unknowingly provided cover for Dorothy's secret activity, never forgave herself for not asking more questions in 1980. She became an advocate for missing persons' families, volunteering with organizations that provided support during the terrible uncertainty of waiting for answers. "If I had been more curious, more insistent about knowing where Dorothy really was on those Tuesday and Thursday nights, maybe I could have saved her," Betty said in an interview years later. "But I respected her privacy, and that respect may have cost her life." The case also led to changes in how missing persons investigations were conducted in small Michigan communities. The revelation that Dorothy had been living an entire secret life, unknown to her closest family and friends, highlighted the importance of looking beyond surface appearances when someone vanishes. Robert Caldwell remained in prison, showing no remorse for his crimes and maintaining that he had been justified in protecting himself from Dorothy's threats. He died of a heart attack in 2009, taking with him any additional secrets about other potential victims who might never be identified. Dorothy Henderson's story became part of the cautionary folklore passed down through generations in Millbrook. Parents told their daughters about the young woman who had trusted the wrong person and paid with her life. Teachers at the high school used Dorothy's case as an example of why it was important to confide in trusted adults about relationships that seemed too good to be true. But perhaps most importantly, Dorothy's story became a testament to the power of truth to survive even the most careful attempts to bury it. Her own words, preserved in diary entries and audio recordings, had reached across 17 years to identify her killer and bring him to justice. In the end, Dorothy Henderson had solved her own murder. Her voice, silenced by violence in 1980, had finally been heard in 1997, speaking with the clarity and courage that had defined her short life. She had dreamed of healing others as a nurse, and in death she had healed her community's long wound of uncertainty and fear. The whispers of the past that had echoed through Millbrook for nearly 2 decades were finally stilled. Dorothy Henderson was no longer missing. She was home, at rest, and at peace, and in the Dorothy Henderson house on Elm Street, where single mothers studied for better futures, her dreams of healing and helping others lived on, transformed by tragedy into a legacy that would touch lives for generations to come. The case that had begun with a simple lie about visiting a friend had ended with the complete exposure of a predator who had counted on silence to protect his crimes. But Dorothy Henderson, even in death, had refused to remain silent. Her truth had survived, and justice had finally found its way home. 10 years had passed since Robert Caldwell's conviction, and Millbrook, Michigan, had learned to live with both the resolution of its greatest mystery and the weight of its darkest truth. The year 2008 marked a decade since Dorothy Henderson had finally been laid to rest, and the community gathered once again to remember not just her tragic end, but the enduring impact of her story on their small town. The Dorothy Henderson house on Elm Street had become more than just a shelter for single mothers pursuing education. It had evolved into a symbol of hope rising from tragedy, a place where dreams deferred could find new life. Over the years, 43 women had lived in the renovated home while completing their studies, and 12 of them had gone on to become registered nurses, fulfilling in their own way the ambition that Dorothy had died pursuing. Among them was Maria Santos, a 31-year-old mother of two, who had fled an abusive marriage and arrived at the Henderson House in 2005, with nothing but her children and a determination to build a safer life. In 2008, Maria graduated from the same nursing program at Cedar Falls Community College, where Dorothy had planned to study, and she accepted a position at Millbrook General Hospital, the facility where Dorothy had hoped to work. "Every day when I put on my nursing uniform, I think about Dorothy Henderson," Maria said during the 10th anniversary memorial service. "She never got to save lives as a nurse, but she saved mine by showing me that it's never too late to pursue your dreams, no matter how impossible they seem." The memorial service was held on September 15, 2008, exactly 10 years after Dorothy's funeral. The Methodist Church was filled to capacity, with attendees ranging from original residents who remembered the search efforts of 1980 to young families who had moved to Millbrook, drawn by its reputation as a safe community that took care of its own. Sheriff Martinez, now in his 15th year serving Millbrook, had become something of an expert on cold cases, frequently consulting with other law enforcement agencies dealing with long unsolved disappearances. Dorothy's case had taught him that patience and persistence could overcome even the most carefully planned crimes. "The Henderson case changed how we approach missing persons investigations," Sheriff Martinez told the congregation. "We learned that people can live entire secret lives that their closest family members never suspect. We learned that predators can hide behind respectable facades for decades. But most importantly, we learned that victims sometimes leave behind the tools for their own justice, if we're willing to look hard enough and wait long enough." Betty Morrison, now in her 70s, had spent the decade since Dorothy's case resolution working with families of missing persons throughout Michigan. Her guilt over not asking Dorothy more probing questions had transformed into a mission to help other families navigate the terrible uncertainty of waiting for answers. "I've learned that there's a difference between respecting someone's privacy and being willfully blind to signs of danger," Betty explained to the younger women in the congregation. Dorothy needed someone to ask harder questions, to push past her polite deflections. "I failed her in that regard, but I've tried to honor her memory by being that persistent voice for other families." The anniversary service also marked the announcement of a new initiative that had grown out of Dorothy's story. Cedar Falls Community College, in partnership with local law enforcement, had established the Dorothy Henderson Safety Project, a comprehensive program designed to educate students about relationship manipulation, financial exploitation, and the warning signs of predatory behavior. Professor Jennifer Walsh, Lieutenant Walsh's daughter, who had followed her mother into law enforcement before transitioning to academia, had been hired to head the project. The younger Walsh had grown up hearing about Dorothy Henderson's case and had been profoundly influenced by her mother's determination to solve it. Dorothy Henderson represents every woman who has been targeted by someone who saw her vulnerabilities as opportunity, Professor Walsh explained during her presentation to the memorial service attendees. But she also represents the strength that comes from refusing to be silenced, even in death. Her story will be taught to every student who walks through our doors, so that future Dorothys might recognize the danger before it's too late. The Safety Project included mandatory workshops for all new students, particularly those in vulnerable demographics, older students returning to school, single parents, women living independently for the first time. The workshops covered financial safety, relationship red flags, and the importance of maintaining connections with trusted friends and family members, even when pursuing private goals. Frank Kowalski, whose demolition crew had discovered Dorothy's hidden evidence, had become an unlikely advocate for historic preservation. His decision to save the Henderson House had inspired him to establish a non-profit organization dedicated to preserving properties with significant local history. The organization had saved 6 other homes in Millbrook from demolition, creating a network of affordable housing that honored the community's past while serving its present needs. "When we found Dorothy's diary and that recording, I realized that houses hold more than just furniture and memories," Frank said during the anniversary ceremony. "They hold secrets that might be important someday." Every old house we tear down might be destroying evidence or erasing stories that need to be told. The impact of Dorothy's case had extended far beyond Millbrook's borders. Lieutenant Walsh, now retired, but still consulted on cold cases, had written a book about the investigation titled 17 Years of Silence: How a Victim's Voice Solved Her Own Murder. The book had become required reading in criminal justice programs across the Midwest and had inspired several other law enforcement agencies to re-examine cold cases with particular attention to hidden evidence that victims might have left behind. Dorothy taught us that victims are not passive participants in their own tragedies. Lieutenant Walsh explained in interviews about her book. She knew she was in danger, and she took steps to ensure that the truth would survive even if she didn't. Every cold case investigator should be looking for the evidence that victims leave behind, the breadcrumbs they scatter in hope that someone will eventually follow the trail. The book's success had also brought unwanted attention to Robert Caldwell, who remained in prison serving his life sentence. Several journalists had attempted to interview him about his crimes, hoping to understand the psychology behind his decades-long pattern of manipulation and murder. Caldwell had refused all interview requests, maintaining his position that he had been justified in his actions. However, the publicity surrounding the case had led to the identification of 2 additional victims from Caldwell's earlier years. Women in Ohio and Pennsylvania had come forward with stories of romantic relationships with Caldwell that followed the same pattern he had used with Dorothy: false promises of marriage, requests for financial support, and sudden disappearances when the women became suspicious. Neither of these additional victims had been murdered, but both had lost significant amounts of money and had suffered psychological trauma that lasted for years. Their testimony had provided prosecutors with evidence to file additional charges against Caldwell for fraud and identity theft, ensuring that he would never be eligible for parole, even if his murder conviction were somehow overturned. Mrs. Chen, who had employed Dorothy for bookkeeping work, had used her savings to expand the Dorothy Henderson Scholarship Fund into a full foundation. The foundation had provided educational grants to over 100 women pursuing nursing degrees, creating a living memorial that honored Dorothy's dreams while helping others achieve their own. Dorothy was killed because she dared to want more than what life had given her, Mrs. Chen said during the anniversary service. Every woman who receives our scholarship is proof that Dorothy's dreams didn't die with her. They multiplied. The foundation had also funded research into the psychology of romantic manipulation, supporting studies that helped identify the tactics used by predators like Caldwell. This research had been incorporated into the safety education programs at colleges and universities throughout the region, potentially protecting countless future victims. Harold Henderson's legacy had also been honored during the 10th anniversary observance. The Millbrook Historical Society had established the Harold Henderson Archive, preserving not just the materials related to Dorothy's case, but also Harold's railroad memorabilia and his extensive collection of local newspapers dating back to the 19th. Harold waited 17 years for answers about his daughter, said Historical Society President Margaret Foster. His patience and faith that the truth would eventually emerge reminds us that some mysteries take time to solve, but they can be solved if we don't give up hope. The archive included the original police files from Dorothy's disappearance, her recovered diary and audio recording, and correspondence from the dozens of law enforcement officers and volunteers who had worked on her case over the years. It served as both a memorial to the Henderson family and a resource for researchers studying cold cases and missing persons investigations. Perhaps most significantly, the anniversary marked the completion of a long-term psychological study of Millbrook's residents, examining how a community processes and heals from a traumatic mystery that spans decades. Dr. Amanda Richardson, a trauma specialist from the University of Michigan, had been studying Millbrook since 2000, documenting how Dorothy's disappearance and eventual case resolution had affected the town's collective psyche. What we've learned in Millbrook is that unresolved trauma becomes part of a community's identity, Dr. Richardson explained during a presentation at the anniversary service. For 17 years, this town defined itself partly by what it didn't know about Dorothy Henderson. The resolution of her case allowed the community to redefine itself around what it learned about resilience, persistence, and the power of truth to survive even the most determined attempts to bury it. The study had shown that crime rates in Millbrook had actually decreased in the years following Caldwell's conviction, as residents became more vigilant about protecting vulnerable community members and more willing to report suspicious behavior. The town had developed what Dr. Richardson termed protective collective memory, a shared understanding of past dangers that helped prevent future tragedy. Young people who had grown up hearing Dorothy's story showed higher levels of awareness about relationship manipulation and were more likely to confide in trusted adults when they encountered potentially dangerous situations. The case had become a teaching tool that transcended its tragic origins to provide practical protection for new generations. The anniversary service concluded with the dedication of a new memorial garden behind the Methodist Church, where Dorothy's parents and Dorothy herself were buried. The garden featured plants that bloomed in sequence throughout the growing season, ensuring that there would always be flowers on the graves. A central monument bore Dorothy's photograph and the inscription she had chosen for herself in her final recording. She dreamed of healing others. As the sun set on September 15, 2008, the people of Millbrook gathered in the memorial garden for a moment of silent reflection. The silence was different from the hollow, anxious quiet that had characterized the town during the 17 years of not knowing. This was a peaceful silence, the silence of questions answered and justice served. Sheriff Martinez stood beside Dorothy's grave as the crowd dispersed, thinking about the lessons her case had taught him about the persistence of truth and the importance of never giving up on the victims who depend on law enforcement for justice. In his pocket, he carried a small card with Dorothy's photograph and the date of her disappearance, a reminder that every missing person deserves the same patience and dedication that had finally brought Dorothy home. Some cases close when you make an arrest, Sheriff Martinez had told a conference of law enforcement officers the previous year. But Dorothy Henderson's case will never really close, because it keeps teaching us things about how to be better investigators, better protectors, and better neighbors. She's been solving other cases for 10 years now, just by showing us what to look for. As the years continued to pass, Dorothy Henderson's name became synonymous not with victimhood, but with the triumph of truth over deception, of persistence over despair, and of a community's love over an individual's. Her story had evolved from a tragedy into a source of strength, from a mystery into a manual for protecting others. The whispers of the past that had once carried fear and uncertainty through the streets of Millbrook now carried different messages, stories of hope, warnings that saved lives, and the gentle reminder that some voices grow stronger with time, speaking across the years to guide and protect those who come after. Dorothy Henderson had wanted to be a healer, and in death, she had healed more than just her own case. She had healed a community's understanding of itself, healed other women's relationships with trust and safety, and healed the persistent wound that unresolved mysteries leave in the collective heart of those who wait for answers. Her legacy lived on in every scholarship recipient who graduated from nursing school, every woman who recognized the warning signs of manipulation because of the safety education programs her case had inspired, and every law enforcement officer who approached cold cases with the patience and thoroughness that her investigation had demonstrated. In the end, Dorothy Henderson had achieved something far greater than the nursing career she had dreamed of pursuing. She had become a healer of truth itself, showing that even the most carefully buried secrets will eventually find their way to the surface, and that justice may be delayed, but need never be denied. The case that had begun with a young woman's quiet ambition to better herself had become a testament to the power of courage, the persistence of truth, and the way that love, whether between family members or within a community, can survive even the worst that human nature has to offer. Dorothy Henderson was no longer missing. She was exactly where she belonged, home in Millbrook, surrounded by the people who had never stopped looking for her, never stopped believing that she deserved answers, and never stopped loving the memory of the quiet young woman who had dared to dream of healing others.